Whenever I get a crazy camera phone, I try to compare it to my professional photography and videography kit. This time, the comparison makes even more sense since the Vivo X200 Ultra has three lenses that can exactly replace the ones I use. Let's start the comparison with a blind test. Decide first which picture is the one you prefer, camera A or camera B. One of the cameras is the Vivo X200 Ultra, and the other is a Sony camera with either a 35mm or 85mm prime lens. For videos, I'm shooting on a cinema camera called the FX30, and for photos, I use a Sony full frame. Regardless of which picture profile you prefer, you can also guess which one is the phone and which one is the real camera. Camera A is the Vivo and camera B is the Sony, and you can guess that by a shallower depth of field and a more blurry background on the Sony. The largest sensor on a real camera, whether it is a crop sensor or full frame, means that you get more light and better bokeh. On a normal camera, you can also change the lens, which can greatly affect the picture quality. On the Vivo, you get three lenses and you're stuck with them, but these three lenses are very similar to what you want to have for versatile portrait photography: a 14mm, a 35mm, and an 85mm. Vivo is basically trying to mimic this mountain of lenses and the camera, which together are worth over €5,000. Let's start the comparison with the main lens. We are gonna compare the main lens of the Vivo X200 Ultra to a 35mm Sony full-frame lens. Let's see how they can compare. The color science on the Vivo is different from Sony. I'm shooting in Zeiss natural mode here, and the Vivo raises shadows on Tanya's face with computational photography. Also, the Vivo is generally more exposed, which is something you want to have on your phone to quickly share your photos on social media. Whereas on the camera, you tend to underexpose to avoid clipping the highlights and to retain more information. Generally speaking, it is easier for a phone to replicate the picture look of a camera even with an inferior sensor and lens, but what is more difficult to replicate is the look of a video, since you need to process a lot more data. An image is just a matrix of numbers, whereas a video consists of a crazy amount of interconnected frames that are compressed. I did change the setting on the Vivo to record at the highest bitrate, but the largest sensor on the Sony can simply create a better image with better dynamic range. That said, the Vivo is keeping up very well considering its size. The Vivo can create decent bokeh, but is still not comparable to what the big lenses on a pro camera can do. The bokeh you get from the main lens on the Vivo gives you nice subject and background separation, considering it's just a phone. And if you want an even more blurry background, you can use the portrait video mode, where the phone creates an artificial shallow depth of field, and it does a decent job of it. Another great thing about the Vivo is that it gives you the option to shoot in log, which means you can get amazing colors out of the camera. I would low-key even argue that I prefer the colors I get out of the Vivo compared to my Sony. They are more realistic and easier to color grade. Even in low-light conditions like in this video, the footage coming out of the Vivo is more than usable. Especially with the compression that social media applies to your footage, you could argue the Vivo is more than enough if you plan to publish your video online. Overall, this 35mm main camera is doing a decent job for Vivo, and I much prefer it over the typical 24mm cameras on other flagship phones, since for me, 24mm is too wide and not a good focal length for portrait photography. And since in low light conditions, you often only want to use the main lens, since it has the largest sensor, you can miss out on some great shots like this one. Vivo also has a great telephoto lens with focal length of 85mm. The second lens that we are going to try today is the 85mm telephoto lens. It's a portrait lens from Sony. I use this all the time for wedding photography and also for just portrait photography. It's an amazing lens. It's an amazing focal length. It's my favorite focal length, and I'm very happy that Vivo X200 Ultra has this focal lens as a telephoto lens. To give you an idea, the 85mm is around 3.7 times zoom on a conventional smartphone, and it is a little bit less than the usual 5 times telephoto lenses that you get on typical flagship phones. I'm also going to compare the Vivo to other flagship phones next week, so subscribe to not miss that video. The sensor size of the telephoto lens on the Vivo is large and it can create decent bokeh. You can also use portrait mode to create even more bokeh, but I personally find that it is usually better to simply create physical separation between the subject and background by distance itself. You'll probably also start to notice that, unlike the 35mm comparison, the Sony camera is doing a better job overall, and the difference is larger. That's simply because the sensor stays the same on the Sony, whereas on not only the Vivo, but all phones, anything other than the main sensor is compromised in terms of quality. That said, especially for buildings and inanimate objects where you want to increase the f-stop on the camera, there is almost no difference between the phone and the camera. And that's great news because this is the type of photography you will likely do when traveling and when you want to dish the weight of the big camera and carry something more compact. Also, I noticed that on the 85mm telephoto lens, the Vivo video is a tad shaky, but keep in mind that I'm outside near the Vienna Opera House and it is always windy there. Talking about stabilization, Vivo and almost all phones have butter smooth stabilization compared to cameras. When walking, the FX30's stabilization is kind of horrendous, and in the camera world, the only company that has semi-decent stability is Panasonic. In comparison, the Vivo looks like we are filming on a gimbal. The third lens that the Vivo X200 Ultra has is a 14mm ultrawide lens. This is one of the largest, if not the largest, ultrawide lenses on any phone, and it's almost the same size as the main lens, meaning you get a lot of light coming into the camera. That means even indoors where there is not much light, the ultrawide lens on the Vivo is doing a great job. If it were any other flagship phone, you would probably end up getting grainy and noisy video. Also, if you're wondering why every time I'm using the FX30 there is a crop, it is simply because it is a crop sensor. But what's important is the proportion of the face and objects, which are almost the same on the phone and camera here and throughout the whole video. Here again, we can see that phones generally create an image that is ready to be posted or sent somewhere with computational photography, whereas on the camera, I have to spend some time processing the image. For example, I have to detect Tanya and increase the shadows to make her brighter. You may also think that in low light, the Sony camera is going to blow the Vivo away, but that's not completely the case. One of the main reasons is that phones also do computational videography, and they apply different algorithms like denoising on the footage. That's why, unless you magnify the video on a very large screen, the difference is not as huge as you may think. But of course, the image and video quality is just part of the equation. The phone is always in your pocket and it also doesn't grab much attention. For example, I use the Vivo for street photography and it's socially acceptable to just use it around, whereas a large camera is going to draw a lot of attention. If I'm not shooting a certain event that needs professional equipment, I don't carry the camera randomly in the city, but that's just me. On the other hand, the Sony camera is a professional tool. For example, the Sony FX30 has 2 card slots, which is very important to me when I'm shooting an important event like a wedding. I can change the lenses based on my needs, and I can also add a case to it and attach as much gear as I want and need for the specific purpose I have in mind. Also, a camera usually has better ergonomics for videography and photography with a grip, sometimes a viewfinder, and all the buttons it offers. The phone, on the other hand, has a large and bright display that lets you see nicely, but it's difficult to use it at certain angles. The Vivo X200 Ultra also has a button that can be used as a shutter, and you can use it to zoom in or zoom out or change the exposure by sliding it, but it doesn't offer nearly as much ease as you get with a dedicated camera. For me, both of the devices have their own purpose. I use the Vivo or other flagship phones when I'm traveling or when I'm wandering in the city, as the camera that is always in my pocket. I use my Sony and Canon cameras and gear for professional use, for my clients, and for YouTube. If you enjoyed this video and want to see how the Vivo X200 Ultra compares to the Galaxy S25 Ultra, watch this video next. Thanks for tuning into Tecmo, and I will see you in the next one.